While attending a Thanksgiving charity event, the millionaire spotted a young volunteer who looked exactly like his missing daughter and wore the same pendant he gave her 20 years ago. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Donovan Reed was a man whose name evoked admiration and respect in every corner of the business world. Known for building a successful real estate empire from the ground up, he was equally famed for his philanthropic work, funding scholarship programs, establishing shelters, and supporting community initiatives. To the outside world, Donovan was a man who had it all: wealth, influence, and a reputation as one of the most generous benefactors in the city. But beneath the tailored suits and practiced smiles lay a man hollowed out by grief. 20 years had passed since the day his daughter, Lila, disappeared without a trace. She had been just 6 years old, full of boundless energy and endless questions. Donovan's memories of her were vivid yet painful. They clung to his mind like fragments of a song that never stopped haunting him. The echoes of her laughter on warm summer evenings, the way she'd tug at his sleeve and say, "Daddy, look." Those moments had turned into whispers that haunted the stillness of his home. In the years following Lila's disappearance, Donovan had thrown himself into his work with a relentless focus, building his business as if he could somehow fill the void in his life with success. But no award or recognition had ever lessened the ache in his chest. When friends and colleagues praised his charitable deeds, he nodded, accepting their admiration while knowing the truth. His philanthropy was an attempt to make sense of a world that had taken so much from him. The loss had changed Donovan, hardening him in ways that only the closest people to him understood. His once easy smile had become rare, replaced by a seriousness that was always present in his eyes. He maintained friendships, but they were surface level at best. No one was invited to see the worn family photos tucked into the top drawer of his desk or the dusty pink ribbon that he kept in his coat pocket, once tied in Lila's hair. Still, he couldn't avoid every reminder of her absence. The approach of Thanksgiving each year brought a sharp spike of grief. It had been her favorite holiday, filled with pumpkin pie, games, and stories told by the fire. Now, the season was little more than a gauntlet of painful memories, softened only by the charity work that marked his annual appearance at the community center. There, he could distance himself from the trappings of wealth and immerse himself in the comforting chaos of giving back, if only for a few hours. Despite his philanthropic reputation, Donovan approached the holiday event each year with a heavy heart. It had become a ritual of sorts, a day to show up, shake hands, and nod at words of thanks that didn't touch him. He'd built a facade, one that even he sometimes believed, to shield himself from the persistent ache that no amount of success or charitable acts could dull. That morning, Donovan stood in front of his bedroom mirror, straightening the tie that felt more like an obligation than a choice. The face that stared back at him was sharp-featured and weathered, with eyes that once sparkled now set with an unfathomable weight. His dark hair, once untouched by time, was streaked with silver at the temples, a visible sign of the years of worry and sleepless nights. A photo frame rested on the dresser, holding the image of Lila at 5 years old, wearing a grin that could light up the world. Her arm was thrown around Donovan's neck, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt with fierce love. It was a candid shot, taken by his late wife, Clara, on an afternoon when everything had seemed perfect. He could almost hear Lila's giggle as he closed his eyes, but when he opened them again, the room was silent. With a sigh, Donovan slipped the pink ribbon from his pocket and traced its worn edges before tucking it back. He gathered his coat and gloves, steeling himself for the day ahead. As he stepped into the crisp November air, the cold nipped at his face, a sharp contrast to the warmth of his memories. The driver, Tom, nodded a silent greeting as Donovan slid into the back seat of the sleek black car. The familiar cityscape rolled by, decorated with twinkling lights and festive banners, as the car made its way toward the community center. Donovan's gaze shifted past the bustling sidewalks, focusing on nothing and everything at once. In the midst of the city's joy, his own heart felt like an island, isolated, unreachable, and marked by a longing that time had not dimmed. The community center buzzed with the warmth and excitement of the holiday, a tapestry of voices and laughter weaving through the hall. Volunteers moved briskly between the tables, balancing plates piled high with turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. The air was rich with the scent of cinnamon and roasted yams, the kind of comforting aroma that wrapped itself around the senses and spoke of home, family, and belonging. Yet, Donovan Reed felt disconnected from it all, as if he were a guest at someone else's celebration. He moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who knew the choreography of this day. His handshakes were firm, his smile polite but distant. Longtime volunteers offered warm greetings, and community members expressed their gratitude for his donations. He responded with nods, a few kind words, but his gaze never lingered. The day's familiarity was both soothing and suffocating. As he approached the serving line, something caught his eye, pulling him from his muted trance. A young woman, her back turned, was ladling mashed potatoes onto a plate for an elderly man. Her hair was dark and slightly wavy, falling just below her shoulders, an image so similar to Lila's that Donovan felt his breath hitch. He took an involuntary step forward, the murmur of the room fading into a hum. She turned, laughing at something the man had said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Donovan's chest tightened. The resemblance was uncanny. For a moment, the years melted away, and he could almost believe it was Lila standing there, her face alight with that familiar brightness. But it was the pendant that truly stole the air from his lungs. It swung gently as she moved, catching the light and reflecting it with a subtle gleam. The same pendant he had given Lila for her 6th birthday, a silver heart with a tiny engraving on the back. "To my sunshine, love always, Dad." He reached up and clutched the edge of the table in front of him, steadying himself as a wave of memory surged. Suddenly, he was back in the garden, the sunlight filtering through the leaves as Lila ran ahead, her laughter ringing like music. He remembered the day he'd placed that pendant around her neck, the way she'd twirled in delight and insisted she'd never take it off. The garden, the smell of roses, Lila's small hands reaching for him, all of it came crashing down like a wave, leaving him breathless. "Donovan, are you all right?" The voice of Michael, an old friend and fellow board member, cut through the fog of memory. He gripped Donovan's shoulder, concern etched across his face. Donovan forced himself to breathe, pulling his gaze away from the volunteer to meet Michael's eyes. "I'm fine," he said, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. He swallowed hard, trying to mask the storm of emotions roiling beneath the surface. "Sure." Michael pressed, glancing in the direction Donovan had been looking. "You seemed a bit pale there for a second." I thought I saw someone I knew." Donovan's voice softened, almost apologetic, as if acknowledging his moment of vulnerability. He glanced back at the girl, now cheerfully handing a cup of warm cider to a child. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged, who found joy in small moments. Driven by a need he couldn't explain, Donovan took another step closer to the serving line. The room seemed to shrink around him, the noise muffled as he zeroed in on her face. He noticed the hint of curiosity in her eyes when she caught sight of him approaching, the way her smile faltered just slightly as their gazes locked. "Hello," Donovan said, the single word heavier than it should have been. His voice sounded strained, unsteady. "Hi," she replied, her tone friendly but cautious. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. Would you like some dinner? He managed a smile, though it felt hollow. No, thank you. I was just admiring your necklace. It looks special. Her fingers instinctively brushed the pendant, and she glanced down at it. Oh, this? It is special. My parents told me I was found with it when I was very young. The statement hit him like a blow. Found, he repeated, unable to mask the tremble that ran through his voice. She nodded, a flicker of something shadowed in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. Yeah, I was adopted. My parents said they found me alone at a train station, and this was the only thing I had with me. The room spun, colors blurring as his mind tried to process her words. Memories collided with the present, the police station, the endless searches, the sleepless nights combing through every lead. He had been haunted by questions that never found answers. And now, here she was, standing before him with the very object that had linked her to his memories. Are you all right, sir? She asked, her voice gentle, pulling him back from the edge of his thoughts. Donovan blinked, the room slowly coming back into focus. He forced himself to nod, but the walls of composure he had built so meticulously over the years felt like they were crumbling. I'm sorry, he said, his voice tight. I didn't mean to trouble you. It's no trouble, she said, her expression softening. Really? Before he could say anything more, another volunteer called out to her, and she turned, giving him one last curious glance before moving to help with the next wave of guests. Donovan stood frozen, the realization settling deep in his chest. He turned back to Michael, who was watching him with a furrowed brow. I need your help, Donovan whispered, eyes fixed on the young woman as she moved further away. I need to find out who she is. The room seemed to pulse with the muted thrum of conversation and laughter, yet Donovan felt like he was moving through water as he made his way back toward the serving line. His heart pounded, each beat steady and insistent as he rehearsed what he would say. He hadn't felt this kind of anxious anticipation in years. Approaching people, sealing deals, leading boardroom discussions, those were second nature. But this was different. This moment was personal, fragile. Camille was wiping down the counter, a hint of exhaustion around her eyes, though her smile hadn't lost its warmth. Donovan paused just a step away, gathering his composure. He could see the pendant glinting against the soft wool of her sweater, a small yet powerful reminder of everything he had lost. Excuse me, he said, his voice as steady as he could manage. Camille looked up, surprise flickering across her face before settling into a welcoming expression. Oh, hello again, she said, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Changed your mind about dinner? Donovan chuckled softly, the sound barely reaching his own ears. No, I'm afraid not. But I realized I never introduced myself properly. I'm Donovan Reed. He extended his hand, which she took without hesitation. Camille Bennett, she replied. Her handshake was firm, confident. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Reed. I recognize your name from the community events. Please, just Donovan, he said, the formality of his title feeling out of place here. He hesitated, the weight of his real intentions pressing against his chest. I wanted to thank you for the work you do here. I've been coming to these events for years, and it's clear how much everyone appreciates your help. A flicker of pride touched her face, and she glanced around the room before meeting his gaze again. This place is special to me. I started volunteering when I was in high school, and it just stuck. There's something fulfilling about being part of a community effort. The word community made something in Donovan twist. It wasn't lost on him that she spoke of finding roots here, in a place that wasn't originally hers. He knew he needed to tread carefully. You must have a knack for making people feel at home, he said, eyes flitting to the pendant again. This time, Camille noticed. Her smile faltered, just a flicker, but it was enough for Donovan to catch. Yes, she said, fingers brushing against the pendant as if to steady herself. It's funny, isn't it? How some things just become part of you. It's beautiful, Donovan said, choosing his words with care. If you don't mind me asking, where did you get it? Camille's eyes shifted, the guardedness slipping in like a shadow. Her hand dropped from the pendant, resting on the edge of the counter. I've had it for as long as I can remember, she said after a moment, her voice quieting. My parents told me it was with me when they adopted me. Donovan's breath hitched, and he masked it with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He nodded slowly, letting her words settle like puzzle pieces that hadn't quite connected yet. That must mean it's very special to you. She nodded, a touch of something unreadable in her expression, perhaps curiosity, perhaps doubt. It is, she admitted, eyes searching his for reasons she couldn't articulate. I don't know much about where I came from before I was adopted, but my parents said they found me with this, and it felt important enough to keep. The noise of the room seemed to swell, every sound heightened and muffled at the same time. Donovan felt the grip of his past tighten, the questions he'd spent 2 decades carrying now rattling their cage with newfound force. That's an incredible story, he said, forcing a steady tone. Have you ever tried to learn more about your past? Camille's face softened into something wistful. When I was younger, I used to wonder. I even asked my parents about trying to find out, but it always led nowhere. Eventually, I accepted that this pendant and a few memories were all I had. Donovan felt the urge to say more, to reach out and tell her why this conversation left him feeling raw and exposed. But the risk of overwhelming her, of breaking whatever fragile connection they were forming, held him back. It must take a lot of strength to carry that kind of mystery, he said, his voice quieter now, the vulnerability slipping through. Camille tilted her head slightly, as if seeing him in a new light. Maybe, she said, her eyes meeting his with a hint of understanding. But I think everyone has something that leaves a mark, whether they choose it or not. Their shared silence was broken by the sound of someone calling Camille's name from across the room. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at Donovan, offering a smile that carried a touch of reluctance. Duty calls. It was really nice talking to you, Donovan. Likewise, he replied, stepping back to let her go but unable to tear his gaze from her as she moved away. The pendant swung with each step, like a small, silent echo of what once was. As she rejoined the flow of volunteers, Donovan felt the room close in around him. His resolve hardened, he couldn't let this go. There were too many questions, questions that had lived unanswered for too long. He turned away, eyes scanning the room for Michael. It was time to seek help, and this time, he wouldn't stop until he found the answers he'd spent a lifetime chasing. The evening sky stretched above the city, painted in deep purples and soft oranges, but Donovan barely noticed as he sat in his study, fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the polished mahogany desk. The room, lined with towering bookshelves and old family photos, was usually his refuge, but tonight it felt stifling. His mind circled around Camille, her guarded smile, the pendant that had become a thread binding his past to the present. A soft knock at the door interrupted his racing thoughts. Marcus stepped inside, dressed in a casual blazer that hinted at their decades-long friendship more than his status as one of the city's top lawyers. His eyes, sharp and perceptive, met Donovan's with a hint of concern. You called, so here I am, Marcus said, settling into the chair across from Donovan. I hope you know it's not every night I miss my favorite show for you. Despite the tension, Donovan managed to smile. I appreciate the sacrifice, Marcus. The lawyer's expression softened as he leaned forward, the light catching in the threads of silver at his temples. You've got that look, my friend. The one I haven't seen since Lila. Donovan's chest tightened, but he nodded. It's about her. Or at least, it might be. He paused, glancing at the photograph of Lila that had sat on his desk for years. There's a young woman at the community center, a volunteer named Camille. She looks so much like Lila did at that age. And she has the pendant. Marcus's brow lifted, skepticism mingled with curiosity. The pendant? The one you had made for Lila's birthday? Yes, Donovan said, voice firm but tinged with disbelief even as he said it. She said she's had it since she was found as a child, abandoned at a train station. Silence filled the room, punctuated only by the quiet ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Marcus's analytical mind shifted into gear, eyes narrowing as he weighed the possibilities. Do you know where she was adopted from? Donovan shook his head. No. That's why I need your help. I need to know if I'm chasing shadows or if there's a real chance, a chance she's Lila. Marcus sat back, fingers steepled as he studied his old friend. You know we have to tread carefully. Investigating someone's background without their knowledge, there are risks. And if she's not Lila, it could backfire. I know, Donovan said, the plea in his eyes unspoken. But I have to do this, Marcus. I can't ignore it. With a sigh, Marcus nodded. All right. I'll start by checking adoption records. But you'll need to do your part too, get to know her better without raising suspicion. A weight seemed to lift, even as nerves coiled tighter in Donovan's chest. Thank you, he said, the words carrying more gratitude than he could express. The following days were a blend of hope and quiet desperation. Marcus worked behind the scenes, sending updates that were vague but promising. Got a lead, one message read. Orphanage records are complicated, but I'm making progress, read another. Each text was like a jolt to Donovan's system, fueling his determination. Meanwhile, Donovan took his lawyer's advice to heart, frequenting the community center more than ever. He volunteered for tasks that brought him into Camille's orbit, helping serve meals or pack food baskets. The more he learned about her, the more pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit. She loved teaching kids math games, just as Lila had always loved playing with numbers. There was an ease in her movements that reminded him of Clara, Lila's mother, a gentle confidence. But it wasn't just similarities that fueled his resolve, it was Camille herself. She was kind, patient with the elderly man who insisted on telling the same story over and over, quick to comfort a child whose ice cream had toppled to the floor. And yet, there was a wistfulness in her eyes, a distant shadow that Donovan recognized all too well. One afternoon, as they wrapped up an event, Camille sat next to him on a bench outside the center. The autumn wind played with the loose strands of her hair, and for a moment, the air felt electric. You've been here a lot lately, she said, her tone light but edged with curiosity. He met her gaze, feeling exposed and uncertain. I have. I guess I've realized how much this place means to me. Camille smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. It's special, isn't it? I always wonder who I'd be if I hadn't ended up here. Do you think about it often? The question came out before he could stop himself, but she didn't seem fazed. Sometimes, she admitted, looking out at the trees swaying in the wind. It's strange not knowing where you came from. I used to make up stories when I was little, princesses and lost kingdoms, she said with a soft laugh. But I've accepted that my life started when my adoptive parents found me. Donovan's throat tightened. He wanted to say something that would bridge the gap between them, to reassure her that some mysteries found their way to answers. Instead, he nodded, silence stretching between them like an unspoken promise. The following night, Marcus called. "Donovan, we have something. I found records of a child matching Camille's description, adopted from an orphanage in a nearby state when she was about 6. Donovan gripped the phone, his knuckles turning white. 6. The age Lila had been. Yes, Marcus continued, his voice cautious. It's still not definitive, but it's worth pursuing. Donovan's heart thudded in his chest. Hope, so long dormant, flared to life, fragile but undeniable. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, the emptiness that had defined his life was about to change. Donovan's resolve carried him through the next few days as he immersed himself in the rhythm of the community center. He signed up for volunteer shifts he had never considered before, rolling up his sleeves alongside the regulars and blending into the hum of daily activities. Camille's presence was a steadying force, her laughter ringing out when one of the younger kids told a joke or when she playfully scolded a volunteer for sneaking an extra cookie. They stood side by side one afternoon, assembling boxes of pantry items for families. The steady pattern of passing cans and folding boxes created a shared silence that felt comfortable. Donovan glanced sideways, taking in Camille's concentration as she examined expiration dates and added a tin of green beans to the growing stack. "Ever wonder what your life would look like if you hadn't come here?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Camille's hands paused mid-air, a shadow of thought flickering across her face before she responded. Sometimes, she admitted, giving a small smile as she continued packing. But this place shaped me. It gave me a purpose and a family, even if it wasn't the one I started with. Donovan nodded, sensing an opportunity. You mentioned your adoptive parents once. Were they supportive of your dream to become a teacher? Camille's smile turned wistful. Very. They were the kind of parents who'd sit through every school play and cheer the loudest, even if I was just a tree in the background. She chuckled, the sound soft and familiar. They always said education opened doors, so they were thrilled when I told them I wanted to be the one to inspire kids. Must have been nice to have that kind of encouragement, Donovan said, the ache in his voice carefully masked. He could see the reflection of his own excitement in Camille's eyes when she spoke, a glimmer of Lila's unfiltered joy. They worked in companionable silence until a loud squeal broke through the room. A little girl, no older than 5, sprinted past, giggling as another child chased her. Camille's eyes followed the scene with warmth, and Donovan couldn't help but notice the way her expression softened. The simple, spontaneous joy of the children stirred something deep within him, a reminder of Lila's playful races through their backyard, always daring him to catch her. You'd make a wonderful teacher, he said, the words carrying more weight than intended. Camille met his eyes, a hint of surprise there before it melted into gratitude. Thank you, Donovan. That means a lot coming from someone like you. Someone like me? He raised an eyebrow. Someone who's clearly done so much good here, she replied, nudging him with her elbow. It's rare to see people who've accomplished so much still show up for their community. Donovan looked down at the cans in his hand, swallowing the lump in his throat. If only she knew how hard he was trying to be present, to find some redemption in these small acts. Can I ask you something? Camille's voice interrupted his thoughts. Of course. What was your daughter like? She asked hesitantly, as if afraid of crossing an unspoken line. I heard from some of the older volunteers that you lost her a long time ago. I hope that's not too personal. A moment of silence stretched between them as Donovan wrestled with memories that were sharp-edged but beloved. Lila was everything, he began, his voice carrying a mix of pain and warmth. She was curious, always asking questions I couldn't answer fast enough. And fearless, too. She once climbed the apple tree in our yard just to prove she could. Camille laughed softly, eyes filled with empathy. She sounds wonderful. She was, Donovan said, his gaze drifting to the window where the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow. Our garden was her kingdom. I can still remember the scent of roses in the air as she played. His voice trailed off, the memory vivid enough to make him blink back a sudden sting of tears. Camille's smile faltered for a heartbeat before she spoke. I have this memory, though it's more like a dream, she admitted, fidgeting with a roll of packing tape. There was a house, a big, beautiful one with a garden. And the air always smelled sweet, like flowers after rain. Donovan's heart missed a beat, the description aligning too perfectly with his own memories. His fingers tightened around the edge of the box, willing himself to stay composed. That's a lovely image. Have you ever talked to your parents about it? Maybe it's something from when you were very young. Camille shook her head. I asked once, but they said it was probably my imagination. Still, it feels real, like something I experienced, not just made up. They were interrupted by an older volunteer calling out that a delivery had arrived, breaking the delicate moment. Camille stood, brushing off her jeans and offering Donovan a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Guess that's our cue to get moving. Donovan watched her go, every nerve in his body taut with the implications of what she had shared. The small, fleeting memories she carried might just be the bridge to the answers he'd spent 2 decades longing for. As he picked up another box, Donovan allowed himself a small, tentative hope. The distance between the man he was now and the father he once had been felt a little less vast, if only for this moment. The community center hummed with the gentle cadence of conversation, punctuated by the occasional clang of cutlery. The Thanksgiving event had reached a lull, the dinner rush giving way to quieter moments as volunteers sat with guests, sharing stories and laughter. Donovan stood near a window, watching the room as he sipped his coffee. His eyes found Camille, seated at a corner table with a small group of children, their faces upturned and animated as she read aloud from a worn storybook. A warmth touched his heart that he hadn't felt in years. It was the way she tilted her head, how her expression softened with each word, that stirred memories of bedtime stories and whispered promises to a little girl who once filled his world. Donovan set down his cup and took a deep breath. If he was going to find out the truth, it had to be now. He crossed the room, careful to mask the urgency in his stride. Camille looked up as he approached, the edges of her smile curving as recognition dawned. She set the book aside, excusing herself from the group of children who groaned in protest but relented when she promised to return. Taking a break from the chaos, she asked, a hint of humor in her voice. I suppose so, Donovan said, the corners of his mouth lifting. His gaze dropped to the pendant resting against her collarbone. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest. I hope I'm not interrupting, but could I ask a favor? Camille's eyes searched his face, curiosity mingling with something softer. Of course. That necklace, Donovan began, his voice steadying itself against the pounding of his heart. It's special to you, isn't it? She nodded slowly, fingers brushing over the delicate chain. It is. I can't explain why, but it's always felt like a part of me. He took a deep breath. Would you mind if I looked at it more closely? There's something I need to see. Camille hesitated, the sudden shift in the conversation palpable. But after a moment, she reached behind her neck and unclasped the chain, holding it out with an expression that was equal parts trust and uncertainty. Donovan's fingers trembled as he took the pendant, turning it over until the back faced him. The engraving was there, clear and unmistakable. To my sunshine, love always, Dad." The sight of those words struck him like a wave, pulling him under the current of emotions he'd fought to suppress for so long. The room seemed to narrow around him, the noise fading to a distant hum. Camille noticed the change in his expression and reached out, her hand hovering just above his. "Donovan, are you okay?" Her voice was cautious, but concern softened its edges. He met her gaze, his eyes shining with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Camille, this pendant," he paused, swallowing hard. "It belonged to my daughter. To Lila." Her eyes widened, and she took a half step back as if needing distance to process his words. "Lila?" she echoed, the name foreign yet strangely familiar on her tongue. Donovan nodded, fumbling for his wallet. He pulled out a worn photo, the edges frayed from years of being carried close to his heart. It showed a young girl with dark, wavy hair and bright eyes, a small pendant resting against her tiny chest. Camille stared at the picture, her breath catching. The room around them seemed to freeze, the air thickening with unspoken realizations. "I don't understand," she whispered, reaching out to take the photo. The resemblance was undeniable, a mirror reflecting back parts of herself she'd never known how to name. "Your parents said they found you at a train station," Donovan said, the tremor in his voice betraying the surge of emotions. "Camille, Lila disappeared when she was 6. She would have been that age when they found you." A tear escaped down Camille's cheek, followed quickly by another. The pendant, which had always been a puzzle piece without a frame, suddenly made sense. "They told me I didn't have any memory of where I came from," she said, voice shaking. "Just this necklace. And a vague feeling of loss I never understood." Donovan felt the sting of tears in his own eyes, but he forced himself to stay steady. "I spent years searching," he said, the weight of those years filling the space between them. "And when I couldn't find her, I tried to accept that I never would. But now..." Camille's eyes met his, filled with a new, raw recognition. "Are you you sure it's me?" The question cracked open something deep within him, something fragile and precious. "I can't be sure yet," Donovan admitted, his voice both hopeful and cautious. "But if you'll let me, we can find out together." A long silence hung between them, thick with the enormity of what lay before them. Finally, Camille nodded, the tentative motion breaking the tension. "I think I'd like that," she said softly, a tremulous smile forming. Donovan's chest tightened with the beginning of hope, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to nurture in years. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. For the first time in 2 decades, the path ahead wasn't filled with shadows. Instead, it shimmered with the possibility of reconnecting the pieces of a life that had once been whole. The drive to Camille's adoptive parents' house was quiet, the car filled with a nervous energy that neither Donovan nor Camille could shake. The trees, stripped bare by winter, stood like sentinels along the road, their branches clawing at the cold sky. Camille stared out the window, her mind racing with questions she hadn't dared ask before. Donovan kept his eyes on the road, glancing at her from time to time, as if reassuring himself that she was really there, beside him. When they pulled up to the modest home, Camille exhaled slowly. It was a place full of love and warmth, the house where she'd celebrated birthdays and learned to ride her bike. It felt surreal to walk up the path with Donovan, a man she'd only known for a short while but who now felt inextricably linked to her. The door opened before they had a chance to knock. Marilyn and Peter Bennett stood there, their faces etched with the concern of parents who sensed that something significant was happening. Marilyn, with her soft eyes and kind smile, reached for Camille's hand. "Sweetheart, is everything all right?" Camille's eyes darted to Donovan, who offered a small nod before turning to Marilyn and Peter. "Thank you for seeing us. I'm Donovan Reed," and this might be difficult to understand, but it's important." The Bennets exchanged a glance, a flicker of recognition crossing their features as they welcomed them inside. The living room was as Camille remembered it, cozy, with a well-loved couch and framed photos from years past. The scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, a remnant from Marilyn's baking. Peter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Please, tell us what's going on." Camille hesitated, feeling the ground beneath her shift. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice wavering, "we think we know where I came from. Donovan believes I might be his daughter, Lila." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to absorb the room's warmth. Marilyn's eyes welled with tears, and she covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Peter sat back, stunned, the weight of the revelation settling into his features. "Lila," Marilyn whispered, the name foreign yet familiar, as if she'd known it in another life. She looked at Donovan, searching his face for truth. "Is this really possible?" Donovan nodded, his voice steady but soft. "Camille was found with a pendant that I had made for my daughter. There are too many coincidences to ignore." Peter sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We always suspected you came from a family that loved you, Camille. We never had any records, just what the orphanage told us, that you were found alone at a train station." A moment passed as the room absorbed the shared history now revealed. Donovan's eyes softened as he looked at the Bennets. "Thank you for raising her with such care. I can see how much love she's had, and I'm grateful for that." Marilyn's tearful smile reflected both relief and an underlying sadness. "We've always known Camille was a gift. If she's truly Lila, we'll be grateful to know the family who missed her all these years." The room felt charged with unspoken emotions, grief for the years lost, gratitude for the love Camille had been given, and hope that answers might finally come. Donovan met Camille's gaze, a silent promise passing between them. The DNA test was scheduled quickly, the days leading up to it stretching out longer than seemed fair. Camille found herself in a state of limbo, caught between a life she'd always known and the possibility of one that had been waiting for her to remember. Donovan, too, felt the tension of waiting. Each passing hour was another spent balancing hope with the fear of disappointment. To fill the time, they immersed themselves in shared moments. Donovan took Camille to his home, a place filled with echoes of laughter and love that had been absent for too long. They walked through the garden, the roses now just spindly branches but still holding the memory of summers long past. "Do you remember this?" Donovan asked, gesturing to a stone bench nestled among the bushes. Camille paused, the sight of it triggering a flicker of something just out of reach. She sat down, closing her eyes. "I don't know," she said after a moment, frustration clouding her voice. "But it feels familiar." Donovan sat beside her, careful not to push too hard. "Even if you don't remember everything, it's all right. What matters is that we're here now." Camille's lips curved into a small smile, the kind that showed both hope and uncertainty. "Thank you for saying that." They spent the days talking, sharing stories of Lila and of Camille's childhood with the Bennets. Donovan listened as Camille recounted birthdays filled with laughter, the little traditions that Marilyn had kept up every year, like reading a bedtime story on Christmas Eve. One evening, Camille surprised Donovan with her own question. "What was Lila's favorite song?" she asked, leaning forward, eyes bright with curiosity. Donovan's smile reached his eyes this time. "She loved You Are My Sunshine. We used to sing it together, especially on road trips. It drove Clara, my wife, crazy when we got too loud." Camille's eyes glistened, and she whispered, "I know that song. It's one of my favorites. Marilyn always said I must have heard it somewhere before, but I never knew why it felt so close. The house seemed to hold its breath as realization took hold, deepening the fragile connection between them. The day the results were due, Donovan and Camille sat in his living room, the clock ticking louder than ever. The envelope, stark and plain, lay on the coffee table between them. Camille reached out first, her fingers brushing the paper before drawing back. She looked at Donovan, who nodded, a silent reassurance. She opened it, eyes scanning the lines until they reached the conclusion. A gasp, soft and unsteady, escaped her. "It's true," she said, the words wrapping around them both, breaking the tension in a rush of relief and tears. Donovan's vision blurred as he reached for her, gathering her into an embrace that was both fierce and tender. Camille held on, feeling the weight of loss and discovery meld into something new, something that felt like belonging. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting the community center in a warm, golden glow. Inside, tables were adorned with centerpieces of autumn leaves and small pumpkins, the air scented with cinnamon and roasted turkey. Laughter bubbled through the room, a steady hum of joy that seemed to resonate deeper than usual. For Donovan and Camille, the day carried a significance that words could scarcely capture. The envelope with the DNA results had been opened only an hour earlier, confirming what their hearts had begun to accept. Camille was Lila. The girl Donovan had searched for through sleepless nights and hollow days stood beside him, no longer a ghost of the past but a tangible, living part of his life. A few volunteers, catching sight of their tearful embrace, had gathered close, whispers of excitement rippling through the hall. One by one, friends, colleagues, and strangers approached, some with tears in their eyes, offering congratulations that carried the warmth of shared happiness. "I don't think there's ever been a better day for a celebration," Michael, Donovan's old friend, said, clapping him on the back. His voice cracked slightly, eyes damp with the emotion of seeing his friend's life finally stitched back together. Donovan wiped at his own tears, a laugh escaping him that sounded as unsteady as it did joyous. Camille stood at his side, eyes glistening, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of affection. She felt like she was waking up from a dream, one that had carried her through years of searching for something she couldn't name. A gentle tap on the microphone interrupted the commotion. The director of the community center, an older woman named Ruth with a voice as warm as a quilt, smiled from the small stage at the front of the room. "I think today's event deserves a little extra acknowledgement," she said, glancing at Donovan with a knowing look. "Donovan, would you like to say a few words?" The crowd's murmur turned into encouraging cheers, and Donovan glanced at Camille. She nodded, squeezing his hand for support. Taking a deep breath, he walked to the front, the weight of the past 2 decades feeling both heavy and strangely light in that moment. He stood before the community, eyes sweeping over familiar faces, people who had worked alongside him, supported his charitable efforts, and unknowingly shared in his silent grief. The noise settled, anticipation hanging thick in the air. 20 years, Donovan began, his voice catching slightly before he steadied it. 20 years ago, I lost something that I thought I would never find again. My daughter, Lila, disappeared, and with her, a piece of my soul. This day, this moment, is something I thought would remain a wish whispered in the dark. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence dense with the weight of his words. Camille shifted, her eyes locked on her father's profile, each word etching itself into her heart. "But life has a way of surprising us," Donovan continued, a smile breaking through. "It brings us challenges and joys when we least expect them. And today, standing here, I am overwhelmed with gratitude that my hope was not misplaced. I found Lila, here, of all places, surrounded by people who understand the meaning of community, love, and resilience." Camille felt her throat tighten, tears welling as Donovan turned to her, his eyes shining. The room erupted in applause, a wave of claps, cheers, and a few shouted blessings. It was the sound of shared happiness, a collective acknowledgement of a miracle. Donovan held up a hand to quiet the room, his voice trembling with emotion. To everyone who's ever doubted that miracles exist, let this day be a reminder that they do. And they come when we least expect them. I want to thank each and every one of you for being part of this journey, even without knowing it. Your kindness has built the foundation on which this reunion now stands. Ruth wiped a tear from her cheek as she nodded, stepping aside to let Camille join her father on the small stage. Camille took her place next to Donovan, the pendant around her neck catching the light and shimmering like a quiet witness to the moment. "Thank you all," Camille said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I grew up always feeling like there was something just out of reach, something I couldn't quite remember. But this center, the love I found here, and the family who raised me gave me more than I could have ever hoped for. And today, I get to add to that with another family I never imagined finding." The applause was deafening, and as Camille looked out at the crowd, she saw Marilyn and Peter, her adoptive parents, standing close together, tears streaming but smiles wide. She nodded to them, a silent promise that nothing would change the bond they shared. Volunteers began to gather around, some hugging each other, others clapping with renewed enthusiasm. Someone started singing, "You Are My Sunshine," the song growing as voices joined in, filling the hall with a warmth that defied the chill of the autumn air outside. Donovan chuckled through his tears, squeezing Camille's hand tighter as they shared a look of understanding. The song, a thread that connected their past to the present, wrapped around them like an embrace. Camille leaned into her father, the room blurring as emotion overwhelmed her. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her name, Lila, carried with both joy and peace. The years of searching, of uncertainty, found their end in that moment, framed by the echoes of the community's song and the steady heartbeat of the man who had never stopped looking for her. The house was alive with warmth, the golden light spilling from the dining room windows into the crisp autumn evening. Thanksgiving had returned, and with it, the laughter and chatter of family gathered together. The scent of roasted turkey, buttery rolls, and spiced cranberry sauce filled the air, mingling with the soft notes of music playing in the background. At the head of the table, Donovan looked around, absorbing the scene like a gift too precious to be taken for granted. Camille sat to his left, her eyes bright as she shared a story that had everyone laughing, something about a mishap with a flour sack during one of her early volunteer days at the center. Marilyn and Peter were across from them, their faces glowing with pride and affection. It was a new kind of normal, this blending of families, stitched together by love and the unwavering bonds they had formed over the past year. All right, Peter said, chuckling as he wiped a tear from his eye. "You have to tell them how it ended, Camille." Camille laughed, the sound full and carefree. "Okay, so there I was, covered head to toe in flour, trying to explain myself while the kids were giggling uncontrollably. And Donovan walks in, takes one look, and says, 'Remind me not to let you near the kitchen next time.'" The table erupted in laughter, Donovan shaking his head with a grin. "And she hasn't been allowed near the kitchen since," he said, lifting his glass in a mock toast. The room fell into a contented hum as plates were passed and forks clinked against dishes. Camille leaned back, taking in the sight of her parents and Donovan exchanging memories, their conversations weaving together past and present. It was moments like this that made her heart swell, moments when she felt the fullness of the life she'd been given. "Camille," Donovan said, setting down his fork and catching her attention. His eyes held that familiar glint of mischief that she'd come to know well. "There's something I've been waiting to tell you." She raised an eyebrow, leaning in. "Oh. Should I be nervous?" He chuckled, reaching beneath the table to pull out a small, wrapped box. He said it in front of her, and the room fell silent as everyone watched. Camille's fingers hesitated for a moment before she tore at the paper, revealing a plaque etched with her name. Camille's Learning Center, opening soon. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Donovan, speechless. He took her hand, his voice tender. "I've been talking to some of the folks from the center and a few city officials. We're making it happen, in honor of the place that brought us back together and all the children who need a space to dream and learn." A murmur of approval rippled through the room, and Marilyn reached across the table, squeezing Camille's other hand. "Oh, sweetheart, that's perfect." Camille swallowed the lump in her throat, tears spilling freely as she laughed. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll make it the best place it can be," Donovan said, a tear slipping down his own cheek. "Because I know you will." She nodded, the emotion too thick for words, and hugged him tightly. The room erupted into cheers, glasses clinking and voices layering in celebration. It wasn't just an announcement, it was a declaration of hope and the belief that something beautiful could grow from what had once been lost. Later, as the evening deepened and the last of the pie was served, the family moved to the community center for the final part of their day. The building stood tall, its facade glowing under strings of lights that illuminated the name newly inscribed above the entrance, Clara's Place. Donovan paused at the doors, fingers tracing the letters that spelled out his late wife's name. Camille watched him, her heart aching with a bittersweet mix of sorrow and joy. He turned to her, eyes brimming but steady. "She'd love this, wouldn't she?" Camille said, her voice gentle. Donovan nodded. "She would. She always believed in creating something that lasted beyond us." Inside, the center was a flurry of activity. Volunteers bustled around, adjusting garlands and setting up tables. Familiar faces from the neighborhood and new friends gathered, voices mingling in cheerful conversation. The space felt alive, no longer just a building but a vessel of community and belonging. Camille stepped up to the small podium at the front of the room, tapping the microphone gently to get everyone's attention. "I just want to say thank you," she began, looking out at the crowd. "This center has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. And now, it's a place where we can continue to grow, support each other, and make sure no one ever feels alone." Donovan joined her, taking her hand in his. "This year, we've learned that life is full of unexpected moments, some that break us and some that piece us back together. This place is a symbol of that, the connections we make and the resilience we share." The applause that followed was both loud and heartfelt. As the music resumed and conversations picked up again, Donovan and Camille stepped back, watching as families embraced and children played tag around the tables. Camille turned to her father, eyes sparkling. "I think we did good, didn't we?" Donovan squeezed her hand, a smile spreading across his face. "We did, Lila. We really did." They stood together, surrounded by the warmth of friends and family, as the lights cast a soft glow over Clara's Place. It was more than a building, it was a demonstration to hope, love, and the bonds that, once lost, had found their way home again.